Does your vision for business match what you see happening on a daily basis? Welcome to Jim White's Circle of Success show, where Jim White brings it all together. For over 30 years, Jim White has worked with organizations and individuals worldwide to help develop and implement excellence. You'll get the inside story on how to create innovative leaders from one corner of your company to the other. Get everyone on your team contributing to the bottom line. Keep building revenue, even when the economy and your customers have flatlined, and more. Jim White's Circle of Success show covers it all, from communication to contract negotiation, from personal fulfillment to revving up cash flow. It's not about theories, it's about showing what works and how to make it work for you. And now, here's your host, Jim White.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the show today. We have a fantastic guest with us today for the entire hour, and it's Naval Captain, and I preference that because a lot of people not in the military get the different captains messed up, and we'll talk about that and as we get into the show, because my captain being an 03 and your captain is a little difference between those captains as we're looked at. And I might add, it's a rare thing to have an opportunity to have an Army and a Navy guy, so we'll talk about that too as well. So the show is dedicated on the National Strategic Narrative. It is absolutely one of the best papers that I've read in a number of years. Captain Porter is the co-author of the narrative, and we're going to be talking about what it is, how it got started, what it is not, and why you should care. So in order to kick us off, take a look at this clip, and we'll be right back with Captain Porter.
Okay, my first question for you is, why this paper, why now?
So this paper, because it comes from two members of the military who don't have a political axe to grind and who are really thinking about their country. I mean, they are people who've willing to put their lives on their line for their country, and they're thinking hard about where we need to go. It's not a sophisticated academic analysis. It's a real story from the heart in many ways about where the United States needs to go in the world and how we have to get there. Why now? Today is the day that the government's about to shut down. If there were no more better evidence of why we need to have a national conversation around where this country is and where it's going in the world, I don't know what's a better example than being in Washington today.
Historically, what are the best examples of where these ideas come from or where these narratives are built? Steve Clemons mentioned the Eisenhower exercise. Now we have something that's percolating up from a different place. Is this how it happens? Can an idea from two serving military men who got together and wrote a paper be the catalyst for building the national security narrative we need?
That's actually a great example of how the world has changed, because I think it's true in the late 1940s, the narrative was much more top-down. So you needed a George Kennan, who after all is director of policy planning, had been in the embassy, really a life foreign service officer. Then you need President Eisenhower having the solarium debates. Today, I think the narrative can come from many different places. It comes from two serving members of the military, but it's picked up by me when I was the director of policy planning at State, by Tom Friedman, who's a New York Times columnist, by other people here, Jane Harman among them, David Absher. So I think the combination of something coming up more from the grassroots, but then having a number of people willing to amplify those voices, that can launch a national conversation in ways that probably wasn't possible immediately after World War II.
One final thought on process. You know, when Congresswoman Harman came here, one of the first vision statements she made to us was about this desire to create some kind of a format and forum for these tough questions that aren't discussed elsewhere in a nonpartisan manner. So you were part of the first national conversation. How about a reaction to that? How did you think it went?
I thought it was great. The chance to be able to have such a range of people, from Brent Scowcroft to Bob Kagan to Steve Clemons to Keith Ellison as a congressman, it was a wonderful chance to really push on some issues that we don't normally push on. We had a discussion about really a conversation about cutting the defense budget that, as I said from the podium, Democrats are very nervous about having, and yet I think we have to have. So if this forum can be a place where people feel more free to say things that they normally self-censor, that's exactly the kind of role the Woodrow Wilson Center should be playing.
Captain Porter, welcome to the show.
Jim, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much.
I tell you, Anne Marie Slaughter, that clip, when I watched the clip as we're planning for the interview today, I couldn't think of a better way to kick it off. And the question was, why now? Why the paper? So tell us about how did this get started?
Well, I'll have to backtrack a bit here. And Truth in Lending, I'm the co-author with Colonel Mark Puck Mickleby, who just retired. Was a former Marine fighter pilot and was working with me at the Pentagon at the time. And in fact, the narrative itself, as a disclaimer, I am required to state that the narrative reflects the views and opinions of Mickleby and myself. They do not reflect the official views of the United States government, the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy, the Department of the Marine Corps, or my current boss, Secretary Panetta. That being said, it was actually while I was working as a special assistant for strategy for Admiral Mullen, who was then chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that we got the idea to begin work on a grand strategy. I had actually written a paper that looked at the phenomenon of global violent Islamist extremism in the context of a complex and adaptive system, a network. And I was asked to have lunch with Secretary Gates, who was Secretary of Defense at the time, to discuss the paper with him. And it was actually at that lunch with Admiral Mullen present, sort of as an aside, that I suggested that what I had written was only a derivative document of what would result if we had a national strategy in place. Truly not a national security strategy, but an overarching national strategy.
So at that meeting, Joint Chiefs, Mike Mullen, then comes back and he says to you, okay, Captain Porter, make it happen?
It's actually a great story. When I made the comment that I thought what was needed was an overarching national strategy, Admiral Mullen laughed nervously and said to Secretary Gates, I think what Wayne's trying to say is that we don't have a grand strategy. Secretary Gates asked me what I had in mind, and I suggested that, I said, sir, perhaps something slightly less focused on risk and threat and more focused on opportunities as a nation. And he liked that, but he didn't bite. So he asked me to follow up on the original paper I had written, and when we walked out of his office, Admiral Mullen turned to me and said, I say we just press. Why don't you go ahead and take a shot at writing a grand strategy? And that's what we did.
How did Colonel Mickleby, how did you two come together? Here, we got a fighter pilot, Marine fighter pilot.
No less.
And no less. And so he's down in Florida someplace, right?
So you have a jarhead and a squid.
Yeah, I wasn't
get those.
I wasn't going to say it, but you.
Puck had been working for Special Operations Command, at that time commanded by Admiral Olson, and he was in their strategy and policy shop. And what he had been working on for about a year and a half at the time was, truthfully, an academic deep dive that studied global trends and how they might impact the future strategy of U.S. Special Forces. So I was familiar with that because Admiral Mullen had seen a presentation of their briefing and came back to me and said, you need to find out who these officers are working on this because they sound an awful lot like you do. I had been speaking to him for quite a while about the need to look at global trends as opposed to the outcomes that were resulting from the impact they had on sovereign nations. So I had known Puck for a few months more or less long distance. We had met several times in Washington when he came up to meet with me. I literally left the meeting with Secretary Gates, went one deck below to my office, called him on the phone and said, hey, how would you like to come to Washington and write a national grand strategy with me? This is how naive we both were at the time. He said he'd love to, and it took some real arm twisting, but I got him orders to come up, and he and I had an office on the E-ring just down the passageway from Admiral Mullen, and we threw ourselves into coming up with something.
And the time frame from you two got together to coming up with this something, which is a pretty good thing and taking the world by storm right now. And we'll get back to that interview that Anne Marie was doing at the Woodrow Wilson Center and how she got involved in the promotion.
Yes.
And you also did a great job in the disclaimer about this is Wayne Porter and Puck. It's not Secretary Panetta. It's your views, which if we saw from the clip was pretty good response from a person, Anne Marie, that was what was she, 2009-11, former director of planning and state for
Policy and Plans at State.
Policy and Plans of State.
In fact, she was the first female to hold that position that was first held by George Kennan, oddly enough. Coincidentally.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't realize that.
Yes.
So she helped, and George Kennan is the author
of the Mr. X article from 1946. It was actually Anne Marie who suggested to us that we use the pseudonym or the nom de plume Mr. Y when the article was released by the Wilson Center to draw a correlation between two inflection points in history. We're certainly not likening ourselves to the great George Kennan, but it is interesting that he was confronted with an inflection point of history, the onslaught of the spread of global communism, and we are here now in a new century facing new challenges and opportunities that aren't necessarily threat related as much as they are the opportunities of a new strategic environment.
We have another clip we're going to take a look at, and set this clip up, and you know who I'm talking about, and Security Advisor General. So who are we talking about?
So this is former National Security Advisor General Scowcroft.
Yes.
When the Wilson Center rolled out the Mr. Y article, they had a panel. They called it the Conversation with America, and it was really intended to use the national strategic narrative as a starting point for a national conversation, which is truthfully what we intended it to be. On the panel were Representative Ellison from Minnesota, Mr. Clemens from New America Foundation, Tom Friedman, who is a journalist and a friend, Anne Marie Slaughter, and then we were honored to have Robert Kagan, of course, as well, and we were honored to have the former National Security Advisor General Scowcroft on the panel as well. So that was actually where this clip was taken from.
And that was in April 2011.
That's
thereabouts,
correct.
Right? April
That's correct.
2011. And from the Woodrow Wilson Center, it says it's the first conversation, if you will, and that was the first meeting.
The paper was released at midnight on the 8th of April before this clip you're about to show.
I tell you. You can also ask any questions and go to Twitter, and I've got to look at it to make sure I get it correct here, but that's Mr. Y and Citizens. So if you'd like to ask any questions of Captain Porter, you may do so. So just send your tweets in, and we are monitoring those tweets at this time. So let's take a look at this clip, and we'll be back with Captain Porter.
First question is, I was interested in all the historical perspective that was added, and when was the last time you would say this country did have a coherent national security narrative?
Ooh, that's a difficult question. I think the best one we developed was in the aftermath of World War II, when the world was changing dramatically, when the Cold War was forming, and whether the circumstances brought forth the people or the people brought the circumstances, I don't know. But I would say 45 to 50 was a very, very creative period.
This reminds me of the whole discussion of a great person in history. Is it the great man or the great circumstances? The context versus the person.
I don't know which it is.
Well, is that the same in this case? To have the national narrative, does a context need to exist to get us there?
Well, I think it helped, but I think the conditions help produce the narrative. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes in a crisis we react poorly. We slipped into the Vietnam crisis. 9/11, we reacted strongly and positively. Now, I don't think it was always in the right direction, but I think the severity of the crisis and the way it mobilizes people, I think, has a lot to do with it.
So are conditions correct now for this type of discourse and this type of narrative building?
Not really. They're difficult, they're awkward, but there's not a galvanizing point where everybody feels concerned. I don't think yet. It's just people say, oh, it's a complicated world.
You mentioned about how long this might take during the panel, and I wonder, in many ways, what we're talking about here is the post-Cold War hangover, maybe accelerated by 9/11, as we try to figure out what our role in the world is without the Soviet Union staring across the ocean at us. How long does something like this take, this type of readjustment?
Well, it's difficult to say, because the point I was making is that technology, broadly saying globalization, is changing the interrelationship of people and states and everybody else, everything else around the world. And that is affecting the traditional thing. We're still mentally in the 20th century, and the world is moving forward. And one of the difficulties is to transfer your thinking to forward-looking rather than the lessons of the past.
One final question about the process. Congresswoman Harman, from the first time she spoke to the staff here, talked about creating this safe space for these difficult discussions that aren't occurring elsewhere. You were part of the first national conversation. Tell me what you thought about the process.
Well, I think it's great, because what they do is consciously try to get people that have different perspectives and bring them together. So this is not a Republican institute or a Democratic institute or a realist versus idealist, so on. And I think that's very valuable.
General Scowcroft, thanks for joining us.
Nice.
That clip, a few things that just jumped out of me, Wayne, when the general was talking. The question, I'm going to paraphrase a bit. Are we ready? And he basically said, no. We certainly cannot speak for the general, nor are we trying to. However, I think he was being quite honest in his answer, not suggesting any other thing, but he's being honest in the fact that this narrative is a real course correction for the United States. And in order to be able to move that forward, we got to be able to set up, I like to call us Americans, but we got different parties, Republican and Democrat, which we're not. But is that not what he said? We got a tough sale to make here. So how would you? That was a long question. So how would you respond to what the general was saying and know? And maybe it's the time to share. Well, people are responding to this, and then we're going to get into it for the after the next segment. What is the narrative? So I'd like for you to walk us through. So
Sure.
I'm just kind of laying out a little things where we'd like to go here.
Let me answer a question you asked me before we went to the clip,
Sure.
and then lead into this. So you asked me what period of time passed.
Right.
I met with Secretary Gates at lunch on July 1st, 2009. Not a date that I would forget, since I don't get to eat lunch with Secretary Gates often. The narrative was finished by 9 August 2009. So we
Wow.
wrote this narrative in 2009, and it took us about 2 years to get it released publicly. All that while, we were clearly focused on being special assistants to Admiral Mullen, but certainly that was percolating in the background. So to go to General Scowcroft's point, are we ready for it? I think what General Scowcroft was identifying is exactly the phenomenon that forced us, that served as a forcing function for us to write this, is we've entered a new civilizational epoch with the oncoming of the information age. This is as significant a shift for civilization, I believe, as was the Enlightenment in the 15 and 1600s. And whereas we have been flexible enough of mind scientifically to to recognize that the Newtonian vision of our physical universe isn't incorrect, it's insufficient to describe the phenomenon we recognize every day in our physical universe. We really never shifted off of kind of this Western Westphalian view of sovereignty that was written 39 years prior to Newton's Principia, 1648, with the Peace of Westphalia. So it occurred to us that we've entered a completely different strategic environment, one that is wholly interconnected, is completely global in nature, and that we needed to recognize this as the challenge and opportunity of a new century, that there is uncertainty in the world. That's what all of the quantum physicists proved empirically in the early part of the 20th century. Uncertainty is a part of our physical universe. We need to embrace that and recognize that uncertainty doesn't represent only risk and threat. There is as much opportunity in uncertainty as there is anything to be concerned with. So our sense was that we needed to shift the focus of our strategies as a country and focus on the opportunities that are inherent in a new century of globalization. And I think that's really what General Scowcroft was getting at. Is the political climate right? Perhaps not. But we didn't write this as a political manifesto. We wrote this as something Americans can identify with as a unifying context, a great term that was just used in that interview.
During this 2-year period of time, you said you had to get it approved to be released. Now, being in uniform, great American servicemen, and that 2-year process was what, looking at some legal process that we could look at this, or we could release it to the public, because it is an opinion from you and Puck.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't really a legal concern. So I don't want to give anyone the impression that there is any amount of control over our freedom of thought or freedom of expression. Certainly not the case. What we were trying to do in those 2 years was we were trying to understand what would be the best venue to have the greatest impact. Initially, we thought this is something, and we talked with Anne Marie about this. We talked to the chairman about this. Initially, we thought that perhaps the right venue would be to run this strictly through government channels. And in fact, again, I talked about our naivete and hubris. Puck and I actually wrote this for the President of the United States. We were hoping the President would actually issue this as a written narrative for the country. It's never been done. We've never had a President write or publish a written narrative that describes the vision and the direction the country is going. And we thought, what a unique opportunity. We had a new president. President Obama had just been elected. We thought we were at a unique point in history where something like that might actually resonate quite well with both parties and internationally. We didn't get there. And that led us eventually to believe that it should just be released publicly and to open a dialogue on such a document.
And thank you for that clarification. That question was sent in by email over the past 3.5 weeks, where our audience was saying, they're in the military, yet they've written this document. And I had one email to come in from a viewer of the Pop Tech, yeah, thank you, video, when you were given that passionate, wonderful disclaimer on Pop Tech, right? So I wanted to make sure we got that out, that no, there's no controls, there's no constraints, however, and that's what makes it so beautiful and I think Anne Marie said it very nicely as well. Just what makes it so beautiful that the interviewer was asked, can two people in uniform make it, and that's what's so beautiful about it, and that's one of the great things that as this continues to pick up momentum, that's the beauty of the whole process, because it is an American document. for the American
And truthfully, as I mentioned, there's a waiver attached to the document.
Yeah.
They are our views only. But it's interesting that George Kennan, when he did write the Mr. X article, was a member of the Department of State.
Absolutely.
And released it as a citizen, not as an official document. It was released in Foreign Affairs, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. So everything's good, ladies and gentlemen. Everything's good. So that's great. Let's get into this wonderful document. And for all of our viewers, you can download this document to website jlwcos.tv, jlwcos.tv. You can download this document. And we're also going to be giving you a website where you'll be able to bookmark, and you can be able to get updates, because I know you've got a lot of speaking engagements, and we'll run through some of this at the end of the program, because this is really going to pick up momentum. As a private citizen, I can speak to we're in an election year, presidential election year. I would love to be able to see the candidates to kind of look at some of this and take on these, at least have a discussion about it. And we're certainly going to encourage that from our side, because I think it's worth discussing. So let's talk about the document. We could be here for months and years and years and years, but let's do some highlights. So when you started writing this, you start off from containment to
Sustainability. And this is interesting. This is a very good news story that's really unfolding as we sit here. So let me explain this. Admiral Mullen pushed back on us when we were first talking to him about the concepts in this document, because he said, well, what is our narrative today? Let me preface that by saying Puck and I decided it didn't take us long to realize that we weren't capable of or smart enough to write a national grand strategy. But we also recognized that maybe that isn't what was needed. We felt that what was needed more than that is the context, is the story that lets Americans, or reminds Americans, who we are and where we're going in this century. So a document that could provide the context for strategies to be derived therefrom. That was what we thought was needed. So we decided to write it as a narrative, as a story. Mm-hmm. When Admiral Mullen asked us what the narrative was today, I was taken aback. I was actually in his office talking with him, and I said, well, sir, we don't have one. And he said, oh, yes, we do. And I said, are you asking me, what do our actions as a nation tell the rest of the world who we are? And he said, that's exactly what I'm asking, and you go write that, and then I'll read this. So that really caused us to think about where we've come from, certainly since the second half of the last century, and where we're going. And it occurred to us that in the last half of the second century, coming out of World War II, we just had an undeniable sense of exceptionalism as Americans. Well, we should. We had the strongest economy. We had the strongest military. We arguably had the most defensible political system in the world. We were the national monetary standard by virtue of the Bretton Woods Conference. So we had it all going for us, and it would have been almost impossible for us not to have a sense that we controlled the variables in the strategic environment of that time. So when we were confronted by the threat of global communism, as identified by George Kennan and others through the Truman administration and on, we developed a strategy of control. We viewed the strategic environment as if it was a closed system in engineering, where you can manipulate enough variables and arrive at a deterministic result. In fact, the strategic environment isn't a closed system, and truthfully, for anyone interested in physics, I'm sure you'll recognize that closed systems trend towards entropy, total disorder. Truthfully, we live in an open system. It's an open strategic environment, kind of a strategic ecology, an interdependent system of systems. And that only by putting energy into that system can we maintain the dynamic equilibrium required to sustain our growth, our progress. So we thought that perhaps we had gotten this somewhat wrong in coming up with the right strategy for the time, containment, which was a strategy based on control and power, when truthfully today's environment is an open system that might respond better to a strategy of sustainability. And instead of control, we would seek influence. And instead of power, we seek strength. And that's moral strength as much as it is military strength. It's economic strength as much as it is military strength. All of those things play. So we kind of decided to take sustainability as the premise for a larger strategy for this century. It's an American strategy, but it's a strategy that we think is more viable in an interconnected and globalized world.
I'd like to read and what a vision to be able to think about where's the United States going in this world. And this is coming from Anne Marie Slaughter in her preface to the narrative. Where is the United States going in this world? How can we get there? And what are the guiding stars that will illuminate the path along the way? I've got those highlighted. It goes hand in hand in everything that we believe in here on the show and all the other work that we do. Is the same question. What's your vision? That's what's your vision. Without a clarity of vision, it is almost impossible to establish a strategy if you don't know where you're going, right? And we have some navigators on the set as well, right? So they understand what we're talking about here, Lieutenant Wheeler. It sets the stage here. Where's the United States going in the world?
Well, I'll tell you, not to interrupt, but let me clarify.
Please
this.
interrupt.
The thing that Puck and I felt we really needed to identify, first and foremost, was what are our enduring interests as a nation? Yeah. Try as we might, we could only come up with two, prosperity and security. And it didn't take us long to recognize the fact that those are totally interdependent. It's impossible to maintain or sustain security without prosperity, and it's impossible to have security without to have prosperity without security, and security without prosperity. But it's not enough just to say that those are our enduring national interests. Those are the enduring national interests of many nations in the world. What makes it different for the United States is that we are not only constrained by values that characterize us as Americans and have since the founding of our republic, as identified in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. We're empowered by those values. Those values are what identify us as Americans. In a globalized world, those values have global implication. Mm-hmm. They're things that we recognize should be sustainable throughout the world. Sovereignty without tyranny, human rights, a rule of law with compassion. These are things that all people strive towards, and we can recognize in them converging interests. So basically, we thought the national strategic narrative boils down to our pursuit of a sustainable approach to the growth of our prosperity and security, underpinned and empowered by values that characterize us as Americans. And that in a globalized world, interdependence isn't a weakness, it's a strength. That by seeking converging interests with people around the world who share many of those values, we can cooperatively compete in a global market. And competition needs to be redefined. We somehow in the last 20 years have become competition averse. And yet competition is what has driven Americans to achieve greatness throughout the spectrum of human endeavor since our nation was founded. In every aspect of science, arts, literature, medicine, space exploration. But somehow in the last half of the 20th century, we've become concerned somehow. We're holding on too tight. we only speak of competition pejoratively. We need to reinvigorate the entrepreneurial spirit and innovation that drove us to greatness as a competitor in the global marketplace.
I tell you, your passion is contagious. Absolutely contagious. And we love it. We got to pay the bills, so we got to take a break. we must pay the bills. So we got to take a break, and we come back. Fair competition. We're going to continue to drill down on that more. And also the investment priorities. There's a few things in there that we could look at.
Excellent.
So we got to get a break in. You're watching KYMB TV, Comcast Channel 19, and streaming live at jlwcos.tv. We'll be back with Captain Porter right after this message.
Business is constantly changing. The challenges of the 21st century have never been greater. There is competition in every field, and technology is more fluid than ever. Bold, innovative thinking is needed. Organizations and individuals are looking for leadership, opportunity, and a way to grow. That way is finally here.
I love teaching. I love sharing. I love sharing from the heart, connecting what I call the heart to the head.
Hundreds of companies and thousands of people have been inspired by one man.
Even from nothing you can accomplish if you have the will, if you have the perseverance, if you will work hard on setting goals and achieving those goals and holding yourself accountable to each and every one of those goals.
Jim White has dedicated his life to inspiring excellence in people.
A+. The man was knowledgeable. He had lived everything he talked about. He was extremely sincere. He was succinct, and he was inspirational.
He's given me some thought and some ideas on how to reset my goals and how to restructure my life.
A hugely successful businessman himself, Jim decided years ago to share his knowledge. Over the past 30 years, Jim White has mentored everyone from Fortune 500 CEOs to small business owners. He has helped numerous companies and individuals achieve their financial and personal goals. His circle of success is a blueprint for excellence and achievement.
I got the strong feeling that Mr. White was speaking from a huge amount of experience built up over the decades, which I think adds a lot of dimension to this kind of a seminar.
Wants to make you get up and do something tomorrow about changing your life.
J.L. White International is a management consulting and leadership development organization. Through workshops and one-to-one training, Jim and his staff have inspired audiences all over the country and have been able to achieve remarkable results by focusing on human capital and designing customized solutions to increase revenue and productivity. J.L. White International is guaranteed to inspire excellence. Isn't it time you discovered what true excellence in business is really like?
Thank you, David, and welcome back with Captain Porter. Prior to the break, we said we were going to come back and talk about investment priorities and then citizenship, right? So you laid out 3 investment priorities, and once again, we need hours and hours and hours, but let's do the highlights there, Wayne. So what are you talking about?
As usual, let me back into this question a little bit here. One of the things that we hit on when we were drafting the paper is the fact that we can't look at the elements of government from a organizational perspective. You need to look at them from a functional perspective. Mm-hmm. And in fact, you need to look at the whole of nation process from a functional perspective. So it's not just security doesn't belong to the Department of Defense, diplomacy doesn't belong to state, development doesn't belong to USAID. These are things that all Americans own, and we'll talk about this in citizenship. But what we were advocating was a functional approach to a national strategy in which development, diplomacy, and defense were approached functionally by all elements of government, but also by the public-private sector through citizenship. So now let's get to the 3 investment priorities. We recognize that it's fine to say that we need sustainability, but what does it mean, and how do you get there? How do you really invigorate a new path for America that will really allow us to leverage the opportunities of this century? And we decided that our priorities were somewhat askew. If we were going to actually reinvigorate our competitiveness as a nation, right now we're 25th or so, 25th to 28th among 15-year-olds tested in mathematics in the world.
Right.
We're 21st to 25th in science.
Right.
We're 14th in reading skills. There's something wrong with that. But it also is an indicator, and it's an indicator that helps us understand why we're now something like 8th in innovation dominance for technology, why we are no longer the #1 nation in manufacturing in the world. These are all related symptoms. So our sense was that we can't reinvigorate our competitiveness as a nation and fully leverage our entrepreneurial spirit and innovation until we invest in our greatest resource of all, which is our youth, the young people of America, whether they're born here or they immigrate here. We need to invest in a diverse and vibrant education system if we are going to regain our competitiveness globally. So our first investment priority was almost a redefinition of what constitutes education in America and how can we make it not just focused on math and science, but actually a generalist understanding and application in an integrated sense. Again, not organizationally driven, math, science, arts, literature, sports. We want to do it holistically. We really want to take a systemic approach to this. So that was the first investment priority. Our second investment priority was recognizing that security means more than defense. In the paper, we say that we believe Americans associate freedom with security. It's freedom from attack, but it's also freedom from disease and freedom from economic hardship and freedom from hateful ideologies and freedom of expression. There are a lot of freedoms that are associated with security, and none of those belong to any one department of the government. Department of Defense doesn't own security any more than development or diplomacy. So our sense was we need a broader understanding of security, and then we need to invest in all of the departments and public-private sectors that can contribute to a stronger and more secure nation. Freedom from anxiety plays into this. And I think a lot of that is associated with a strong economy. The third priority, though, is recognizing the fact, and a lot of people focus, when we talk about sustainability, they focus on the climate and resources. That's part of it. Sustaining a healthy economy is important. Sustaining healthy security is important. But to be fair, the third priority we recognized is the fact that by the midpoint of this century, 2050, we're going to have 9 billion people on Earth. And the middle classes in 2 of the world's largest countries, India and China, are just booming, just as our middle class was in the 50s. And they are now becoming consumers, and they are taking kind of the same rapacious approach to resources that we took as we were booming in our economy. The unfortunate thing is that many of the resources in the world are finite. Not all, but some are finite. Others are renewable. So our sense is to avoid friction points in the future and actually to sustain a vibrant global economy, we need to invest in the development of and ensure access to renewable resources. And this is renewable sources of clean energy, but it's also agriculture, a sustainable base of agriculture in the United States and the world, fresh water, food security, water security, and energy security. Those are all wrapped up in that last one.
I tell you, off camera, that's the beauty part about live television. Is you were talking, I was sitting here just nodding my head. Yeah. And to support that, January the 2nd show, I did a show about our veterans. And it was a personal show to me as I started off. I'm a Vietnam veteran, Special Forces Ranger, injured, disability, and Ranger Creed. And I was joking on the show that we obviously will have a debate between the Navy and the Marines and all of us, but the Ranger Creed is the creed, so I just want you to be aware. But it brings tears to my eyes when what we believe and what you've been doing for your country in uniform for so many years, and it has such a foundation to what you're talking about here. And part of this course correction is, and I know I'm going to get a little sidebar here a little bit, but I'd be remiss if I didn't reach out, because I am absolutely adamant about the young men and women that are coming back to the U.S. in this challenging time for the economy. We got to give them an opportunity. We got to give them a job. For those young men and women that are all volunteers that are not coming back, and for those young men and women that are coming back with limbs and all of the things that you know so well. So to be able to sit back and say we need a national strategy, I think part of that national strategy kind of fits into making sure that we're doing, I'm going to use the word, for lack of a better word, for the right things for those people serving in uniform. So I just wanted to get that in, and I know we could talk about that.
No, but let me
but
we have to address it right now, because I fully agree, and I fully agree, and it's an important issue. But let me just say this: we need to recognize the returning veterans who are coming back to the country now. All of our veterans, we need to recognize them not as part of an economic problem or an unemployment problem. We need to recognize them as the incredible employment resource they represent. These are some of the country's most mature, demonstrated leaders who have proven a commitment. They've sworn to support and defend the Constitution. These are American citizens who have something special, and that is a demonstrated commitment to this country and to their fellow American citizens. And they are a resource. They're not a problem for us to deal with. They are part of the solution set that will help us in a sustainable strategy for the future.
Couldn't agree with you more, Wayne. And talking about the education, at the top of the show, I said your bio is so impressive, it's hard to get everything in, but I want our viewers to also recognize the level of education that our men and women have an opportunity. You yourself was at the Naval Postgraduate School. You left with 2 master's degrees, not 1 but 2. You're back in a PhD program. So we have some talent, and I agree with you. For all of the private sector employers, is take a look at the talents available for our returning veterans. I mean, I am so adamant about that. And like I said, a little sidebar from the narrative, but not really. It's part of the process.
It's not, because I'm going to have to jump the gun, because
please.
I want to get this in before we run out of time. It was a perfect segue into the conversation about citizenship.
Absolutely.
The one thing that I'm grateful for, and my son is a Marine officer, so I'm grateful for his service. I'm grateful for your service. I'm as indebted to any American who has served in the military as anyone. That said, it begins to bother me when Americans take so much pride in our American armed forces and so little apparent pride in their own citizenship. It's almost as if they are ceding responsibility to our American men and women in uniform. America doesn't just belong to those who have sworn on paper to support and defend the Constitution. It belongs to all of us, all citizens. Puck Mickleby, my partner in writing this paper, frequently says there's a difference between residents and citizens. Residents pay rent. And it's true. They often don't care too much about who the next occupant of that space is going to be either. And yet our preamble of our Constitution says that we are trying to provide for liberty for ourselves and our posterity. And that's what sustainability is all about. That's what we're trying to get at. And it is American citizens who need to take this forward, not just the military, not just those in the government. It's all Americans, public, private sector, civilians, uniformed, non-uniformed. Everyone needs to recognize they have a positive role to play. All of us have the ability to make positive change. I would submit we have the responsibility to make positive change.
And I like that choice word, responsibility. We all have a responsibility. I've been doing a show on a radio show and on television and bringing it in on the Constitution for the past 6 months. And as we drill down and as we step back and we actually analyze the words, and when our mutual friend Dr. Ted Lewis introduced us, and we'd be remiss not to acknowledge those wonderful people at the Center of Homeland Defense and Security at the Naval Postgraduate School, because it's all the people making the narrative move forward, and a lot of people that's doing this are saying, how many millions of dollars can I get out of this deal here, right? Well, we all got to pay the rent, but what's been done here, and as you know, it took me a little bit to get my arms wrapped around it. Why are you doing this, right? Or what's in it? What do you want as a result? And it's clear to me today, real clear, that it's your passion, and Anne Marie said it very well. It's coming from the heart.
It is coming from the heart. And let me just add one thing, because I have to say this. I just said, and I was thinking about this when you were talking just now, I just said how proud I am of my son, who's a Marine officer.
Right.
I am equally proud of my 2 daughters, both of whom are active in their own ways, in their own communities. One of my daughters is what I consider to be a model citizen. She's my other daughter is studying hard in school, and she's going to be going in this direction as well. But my oldest daughter has decided to create with her daughter a Helping Hands blog, where people can log in, and she will vector them to all kinds of different charities and organizations and things that they can do to help other people. She gets nothing out of this, but she's dedicated her life to this, in as well as raising her daughter and working full time. It means something to her. It is a passion with her. And that's what it needs to be for all Americans. I apologize because I do get passionate, but I think all Americans desperately want to get passionate about reinvigorating our leadership in a global strategic environment. And the world is desperate for us to do this. So we're on the right path. I said before, it was encouraging to me. The Department of Defense, for instance, just released last week new strategic guidance. General Dempsey, Secretary Panetta, it is very much aligned with many of the concepts that we wrote about in the narrative, because they're just kind of the right things to do, I suppose. But they also talk about sustainability. The Office of Secretary of Defense about 2 or 3 weeks ago released an energy sustainability plan. It's where we're going as a nation. I think more and more people are recognizing this. We didn't invent this. We just came on this through all the reading that we had done and all the thinking about it that we were able to do, because Admiral Mullen had the patience to allow us to sit in a room and think big thoughts.
And we are in the hometown of our Secretary Panetta, and at the Panetta Institute, Sylvia and Lynn, in my view, one of the great public servants. And we're going to make sure that, Mr. Secretary, that you get a copy of this. and he knows he's hearing me, so he knows who's talking now. So we're going to make sure we get a copy of this, and you're going to read this thing.
To be fair to Secretary Panetta, I am assured he has read this.
I understand, but we're local boys, so we got an opportunity to kind of do the local boy thing here a little bit. I am absolutely certain because he doesn't miss anything.
I well know.
Yeah, he doesn't miss anything. So thank you for your support on that, Leon. But we're out of time. We're out of time, and I didn't get everything I wanted to do, which is quite normal. But we're out of time. We're going to have to do it again, but we're going to forego one clip because I'd like for you to briefly run down the website. What was the website again? Okay, we're going to do this. We're going to get the website here up to the studio, and while we're getting that, you are doing some speaking. Just run down your list and where you're going to be, and how people can participate or continue
Absolutely.
to support this.
Truthfully, it's not just me. And like I said, it was Mickleby and me put the paper together, and we're really most encouraged by the fact that some elementary schools have picked up on it, universities have picked up on it. It's just being discussed, which is all we wanted it. That was our intention, was that it would open a national dialogue. Here I happen to be fortunate enough to be the chair of the Systemic Strategy and Complexity at Naval Postgraduate School. And in that capacity, I am now able to speak at a number of different academic venues. So I'm going to be speaking at the Camden Conference in Camden, Maine in February on the 17th and 18th. I'll be at Tufts University the 22nd through the 26th. And Puck and I are speaking. Puck is joining me in those. And Puck Mickleby and I are speaking in New York City with Anne Marie Slaughter on the 24th at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy.
You got a busy schedule.
And I'm falling behind in my own studies.
Well, I was going to say, you are here. You're working on a PhD. I don't know. And your wife says, what next? I'm sure she does. Okay, the website, nationalstrategicnarrative.com. nationalstrategicnarrative.com. And also through jlwcos.tv, we're going to have a link to make sure that you can get there as well. So we'll relink that. But that website is up and coming. You got to remember that the majority of the people supporting this effort, they're volunteers.
Yeah, this was actually
students.
Completely spontaneously generated. I had nothing to do with this. I'm delighted to see that it happened, but it spontaneously generated by some very, very dedicated people. I'm grateful to them for that.
So am I, and it's just great. In addition to the speaking engagements, we're going to have to figure out some other way, because in February there's a huge conference at the center. Mid-February 23rd to 24th, and we got some great thinkers and students and coming in from that. So we are now, and I'm just announcing it for the first time because staff was saying, "What's he doing now?" We're at more work, right? So I'm trying. So yeah, more work to come. We're going to try to put together a panel. We're going to continue to reach down all these bright minds, and I really want to continue our effort for as our veterans are concerned.
Yes.
Working with the different veterans organizations, and to the private sector. We got some quality individuals available as a result. Great leaders available for the sector. So. Wow. You have been a pleasure, sir.
Thank you. And I am not the brightest bulb by any means. The men and women of the Armed Forces are spectacular. I have a huge indebtedness to Secretary Panetta for letting me come to Naval Postgraduate School.
Thank you.
And just super work being done by the Department of Defense and all of the departments of our government.
It's interesting. Heather Isseron, just phenomenal when the director worked for Ted Lewis over at the center. And I just love it for what she says. And I am being told I'm talking too much as normal. So I've got to get out of here. This is Jim White saying thank you so much for joining us. Captain Porter, thank you, sir.
Thanks very much.
You're watching KYMB TV, Comcast Channel 19. We'll be back next Monday.
This has been Jim White's Circle of Success Show. Please visit our website, jlwcos.tv. Join us next time as Jim White brings it all together on Jim White's Circle of Success.